Now we proceed to the professional part of this seminar. Quality education is the most valuable asset in our societies today. Achieving that requires strong commitments from everyone, including governments, teachers, local governments, parents, students, and researchers, of course. How to succeed in providing both quality and equitable learning outcome is a big issue, both in Norway as in other countries. When we planned this grand opening, our new offices for the Directorate for Education and Training here in Oslo, we had high ambitions. We wanted to invite you, the key people in education in Norway, to hear one and only one leading international academic give a lecture on the most relevant field concerning the achievement of quality in education for all. Nothing less than that. We don't want to waste the most important people's time. We started on the top of the list. Some of us had heard Dylan Wiliam before, for instance in Paris 2 years ago at the OECD CERI conference, Learning in the 21st Century. Others heard him last year in a big conference in Malta. And there is also a growing interest in Norway in the field assessment for learning. And the Directorate will soon start a 4-year project that will focus on assessment for learning in both primary and secondary school. Assessment is therefore one of the main focus areas for the Directorate. What would be more perfect than for the grand opening and the reception, than to have one of the world's leading researchers in this field of assessment. So we tried, we called Dylan Williams, and we succeeded at the first attempt. We are very pleased to have Professor Dylan Wiliam here today, and Professor Wiliam, the floor is yours.
Tack. And that exhausts my Norwegian. So. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the celebrations of this wonderful new building for the Directorate. I wanted to talk to you today about assessment for learning, why we need it, what is it, and how we can begin to support this in every single school in Norway. The argument I want to make is that we need to improve levels of educational achievement, and I want to convince you that the only way to do this is by improving teacher quality. Improving the quality of new entrants into the profession is important, but it takes too long, so we have to help the teachers we already have working with us to improve. I want to convince you that teachers can change in a range of ways. Some of these will benefit our students, and some of them will not. The ones that do tend to focus on the practice of teachers, what they actually do in classrooms. And it's turning out to be much harder to change that than it is to change curriculum or examination systems. And the problem is that it's the only thing that matters. Changing practice requires new kinds of teacher learning and new kinds of teacher professional development. And although I only have 45 minutes to an hour with you today, I want to try and suggest some directions that you might wish to explore in taking forward this job of helping every single teacher in the country improve. The first 7 steps in the argument are matters of science. If you disagree with me, you are wrong. I can prove every single step in that argument. What we don't yet know much about is the last 2 bits, how to help teachers to do this, and that's why we call these matters of design. These are matters where we are still learning about how to create the best conditions for teacher learning, and I will just share a few thoughts about the work that we've done in the USA and in the United Kingdom about what kinds of teacher learning seems to make the biggest difference to students. Raising achievement matters. It matters for individuals, and it matters for society. With higher levels of achievement, you earn more money, you are healthier, and you live longer. Now, doing that research takes quite a long time because you have to wait for people to die before you can work out the impact of education on longevity. But the latest estimates we have are that 1 extra year of schooling adds 1.7 years to life. So these are high stakes for the individual. They're also high stakes for the country. With high levels of education, you have lower criminal justice costs, lower healthcare costs, and increased economic growth. A recent publication by the OECD suggested that if we could raise PISA scores by 25 points across Norway, the net present value to the Norwegian economy would be $1 trillion, $1,000 billion. And if we could actually ensure that all students score 400 or more on PISA, the net present value to the Norwegian economy would be about $1,500 billion. These are high stakes. One of the things that we do not do enough of, I think, as educators, is to make the point that education is the driver of our future economic prosperity. It's education that makes countries rich. But we need also to understand that the world of work is changing. Which of these following categories of skill do you think is disappearing most rapidly from the workplace? Is it routine manual, non-routine manual? Is it routine cognitive skills? Is it complex communication? Or is it expert thinking and problem solving? Could you all vote now by holding up 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 fingers? Which of those categories of skill has disappeared most rapidly from the workforce in developed countries over the last 30 years? Can I just point out that if you haven't voted, I can tell. Thank you. Most of you, like me, thought it must be 1, routine manual. It's not. In fact, routine manual skills have declined, that's the green line here, but by about 2%. There's been a huge increase in the demand for complex communication and expert thinking and problem solving, but the fastest decline of all, particularly over the last 20 years, are routine cognitive skills. The ones that our basic skills tests are very good at testing. Those skills are now being automated so rapidly. The things that we need to be focused on in schools are the things that computers can't do quickly, like solving problems, like communicating complex matter to people. So the world of work is changing. Don't forget that your schools are preparing children for a world we cannot possibly imagine. Who wanted to be a web designer or a nanotechnologist 20 years ago? Those jobs didn't exist. The most popular job in 20 years' time will probably be solving a problem that we don't even think is a problem yet. And so the challenge for us is, how do we improve? The other thing that's interesting is that skill is becoming more and more valuable. If you leave school at 16, if you left school at 16 in America in the 1970s, you could expect to earn $13 an hour. And by 2005, you'd be learning less than $11 an hour in $2007. Now, America is approximately twice as wealthy as it was in 1973. But if all you have is education to the age of 16, you are now worse off living in the United States than you would have been 35 years ago. Who has benefited? The people with high levels of skill. Now, governments understand this. Governments understand the need to raise achievement. And they spent a lot of time doing things that haven't made much of a difference. The Gates Foundation funded lots of smaller high schools in America. Doesn't seem to have made any difference. In England, we're actually putting super principals in charge of lots of schools. Doesn't seem to be making a difference. Getting rid of middle schools and putting them with elementary schools doesn't seem to make a difference. Curriculum reform. The Scots have introduced a new curriculum in Scotland. It's called Curriculum for Excellence. I'm so relieved. I was worried. I thought they might go for a curriculum for mediocrity. Every government now has a curriculum for the 21st century, but if it doesn't change what happens to students in classrooms, it's a complete waste of time. Most textbooks don't make any difference. In America, charter schools and private schools being brought into the state system are very popular. Education vouchers. Computers. I I've been told that computers are about to revolutionise our classrooms for the last 30 years. And I'm still waiting. And when we filled our schools with as many computers as we could fit in our closets, the computer companies found something even bigger and more expensive to sell us, the interactive whiteboards. Now, in the hands of people who know what they're doing, interactive whiteboards are stunningly impressive pieces of equipment. But what we do know from a recent study in London is that by themselves, they don't do any good. Because the government was so keen on these, they gave every school in London an interactive whiteboard, whether they wanted one or not. And what we showed was the net impact on student achievement was precisely zero. And the other shocking finding from England is that the addition of classroom assistants, particularly in primary schools, to help teachers with their work, appears to have made no difference at all. In fact, if you are a student and you are given a classroom assistant to help you, your achievement will be lower than it would be if this classroom assistant was simply not there. Because we didn't give the teachers enough time to work with the classroom assistants and train them and to brief them, and they didn't have any training themselves, so when they were asked to help a student, they saw their job as helping the student do the work. And so they did the work for the student, and the student handed in a piece of work that looked very good, but all the thinking had been done by the assistant, not by the student. And in every place where we studied this, classroom assistants lowered student achievement. Now, private schools are an interesting policy move. This shows data from the OECD about the prevalence of privately funded schools. So the first bar is government funded, and the faint bar here is privately funded. What's interesting is that in most countries, private schools get better results than publicly funded schools, but they also take different kinds of students. And when you control for that effect, which is the pink bar over here, in almost every country, public schools are better. There's actually no school, once you control for social class, there's no country in which private schooling is better than public schooling. So vouchers and charters are unlikely to make a difference. Governments keep on pursuing policies that are easy to pursue because governments have a timescale that is fundamentally different from the transformation of educational systems. And so they keep on pursuing short-term policies. They look for quick wins, as the ministers describe it. Give me a quick win. And what we've actually learned is that some people think that schools make a difference. And if you go and look at some research that was done in the 1970s on school effectiveness, you find that some schools get very good results and some schools get very bad results. So the policy idea has been, let's have more schools like the successful ones. And if you want to have more schools like the successful ones, there are three things you need to do. One, get rid of the boys. In every developed country now, girls do better than boys, so the more girls you've got in your school, the better you're going to look. In many countries, becoming a church school is also a good idea. But there's no doubt that the biggest thing you have to do to raise your school's results is to move it out of the inner city into a nice, comfortable suburban area where the parents have got lots of money to pay for private tutors for their children. Because everybody thinks it's a good school, even when the teaching is being done by private tutors at the end of the school day. It turns out that schools don't make that much of a difference. Demographic factors account for most of the difference in school outputs, and the conclusion from this is that schools don't make a difference. And that's actually something that's been borne out all over the world. Schools make much less difference. As long as you go to school, it doesn't matter very much which school you go to, particularly in Norway. But it matters very much which classrooms you're in that school. An effective school is simply a school full of effective classrooms. And that requires new kinds of leadership. My mother tongue is Welsh. And in my mother tongue there's a famous legend of a giant who is leading his troops across the countryside, leading his army, and they come across this big chasm with a river at the bottom which is too deep to wade through, and there are rocks in the river that are too close together to use their boats. So they discuss how they're going to get the army across to the other side. And eventually, the giant decides that he will lay himself down across the chasm, and they put hurdles on his back, and his army walks across his back to get to the other side. That's the legend. The proverb that is still in use in Welsh today, that comes from that legend, is, "He that would be a leader must be a bridge." And I think that's a very powerful metaphor for leadership in schools. The job of every single leader in a school is not to go around being heroically leader-like. It is to help every single teacher in every single classroom do a better job. That's the value creation engine in every single school. And that's why leadership in education is so difficult, because you are successful almost entirely through the work of others. And this data from the OECD just shows how big the school effect. So this, above the line in white, is the within-school variation in students' results, and below the line is the between-school variation, but then the grey and the black are how much of that is accounted for by differences in the students going to that school. So the red here is the size of the school effect. And certainly in the Scandinavian countries over here, we find that very little of the differences between schools are really between-school differences. In other words, only about 5 to 6% of the variation in student achievement is accounted for by the school effect. It turns out that it doesn't matter which school you go to as long as you go to school. It matters which classrooms you're in, and in particular, it matters which teachers you get. 90 to 93% of the variability in the proportion achieving a level of proficiency, for example, is nothing to do with the school. So 7 to 10% is the school effect. And what this means is that if you went to a really good school in Norway, if 15 students achieve a particular standard in the average school, then only 17 would do so at a good school and 13 would do so at a so-called bad school. And I think those differences are much smaller than most people would imagine. It matters for those 4 students who actually either succeed or fail, but for most students, it doesn't matter very much which school you go to. And it's not class size, it's not between class grouping, it's not within class grouping, it's simply how good the teacher is. Bill Sanders' work in Tennessee showed that if you are an average student starting at the 50th percentile of achievement at the age of 8, if you get a high-performing teacher 3 years running, you'll end up at the 90th percentile of achievement. If you get a low-performing teacher 3 years running, you end up at the 37th percentile of achievement. Which teacher you get makes a huge difference. Now, this conversation about teacher quality is politically very difficult, because the unions have secured important advantages for their members by pretending that all teachers are equally good. They've resisted performance-related pay, and I think that's quite right, because performance-related pay is impossible to do in teaching. Even if you tested your students every single year, and you look to see in which teachers' classrooms are there the biggest increases in test scores, it's not safe to assume that that's the teacher who's teaching well. If I'm teaching 9-year-olds, and I spend a lot of time developing skills of collaborative learning, of group work. I spend a lot of time getting the students involved in metacognition and thinking about their thinking. I might not cover all the things I meant to cover that year. But the teacher who teaches that class next year will look very good because of the foundations that I laid. So performance-related pay is impossible to do in practice. And I think, therefore, I understand why the teacher unions have resisted this. But what it means is that we've pursued policies with very poor benefit to cost. Politicians also like the conversation to be about teacher quality, about teachers all being equally good, because then it makes the conversation much easier. You set the same pay for all teachers. Well, actually, you don't. In America, they don't talk about performance-related pay anymore. They talk about differentiated compensation. And it's an important shift, because actually in Norway, you have differentiated compensation. You just pay teachers for getting older. Don't you? You don't pay teachers for getting better, but you do pay them for getting older, pay them more. So every country has differentiated compensation. The question is, on what basis is the calculation done? So politicians quite like the idea of setting a threshold. We want a well-qualified teacher in every classroom, they say. I don't. I don't want a well-qualified teacher in every classroom. I want a good teacher in every classroom, and they're not the same thing. What we're learning is that qualifications are a very, very weak way to find the best teachers. What we know is that advanced content matter knowledge accounts for most of the differences between, about at most 5% of the difference between teachers. Hardly anything. Even their pedagogical content knowledge, how much they know about the subject that they're teaching at the level at which they're teaching it. Maybe 15%. This is quite surprising. Deborah Ball's work at the University of Michigan showed that if you're taught maths as an 8 or 9-year-old student by a teacher who is very knowledgeable about teaching maths to 8 and 9-year-olds, you will learn in 50 weeks what children taught by the average teacher will learn in 52 weeks. So is it better to be taught by a more knowledgeable teacher? Yes, but not much. 50 weeks learning instead of 52 weeks. So what's surprising is when we try to pin down, we know that teachers make a difference, but it's very hard to pin down what makes the difference in teachers. And the work that we've done suggests that about 50% of the difference between teachers is none of these things, even when they have a master's degree. It's pedagogy. It's pedagogical skill. It's the range of pedagogical repertoires. Now, teachers do improve over their career. In a lot of the American literature claims that teachers don't get any better after 5 or 6 years, but that's actually not true. This is a much more sensitive piece of data collection by Andrew Lee from Australia, and shows that teachers' productivity, how much more their children learn, does increase over a 20-year career. But the scary thing is how small the improvement is. So if you are taught by a 20-year veteran, taught reading by a 20-year veteran as opposed to a novice, you will learn an extra half a month per year. But we shouldn't be surprised by that, because most of the professional development we have done with teachers has been a complete waste of time. So all we know is that if you do the wrong kinds of professional development, teachers don't get very much better. What we need to start thinking about is what kinds of professional development would make teachers much better, much more quickly. And the answer is by focusing on practice. Many politicians like to talk about raising the status of teaching. And of course, if we had the luxury that Finland does of having the smartest college graduates wanting to be teachers, there are some universities in Finland where it's harder to get into the teacher training program than it is to get into medical school. You do not have that luxury in Norway. And the other thing that we've seen, the emancipation of women appears to have lowered average teacher quality. Back in the 1950s and 60s, for many women in the developed world, it was nursing or teaching. So we had a lot of extraordinarily able women going into teaching because that was the only thing that was socially acceptable. Now those women have a far greater range of careers. And that's great, but the price that we're paying is that the constrained market that we used to have means that it's actually harder to get the smartest people into teaching because of the range of options. But what we discovered is that even if we knew what made a great teacher, and we could spot it immediately, and we could stop the lowest performing 30% of teachers from getting into the profession right away, this would result in one extra student passing a test per class every 3 years. Because it would take 30 years to work through the system. So, if we are serious about harnessing the power of education to boost Norway's future economic prosperity, we have to help the teachers we already have working in our schools, in your schools, help them get better. What I call the love the one you're with strategy. Don't wish you had better teachers, create them by helping the teachers that you are working with right now be even better. The problem is that we aren't very good at this at the moment. The average improvement in student value added by a teacher over 20 years is 1/10 of the difference between a good teacher and a weak teacher on the very first day of their teaching career. Teachers are hugely variable. We've been using the wrong kinds of professional development. We've been talking about professional updating. Education is not like surgery. In surgery, there are new things to learn. But in terms of teaching, particularly in terms of pedagogy, I don't think there's been anything new in the last 2,000 years. Good teachers have always been good teachers. So the idea of recertificating, making teachers apply for their jobs, what you do then is you prove that teachers have done a certain amount of professional development. And what happens is you end up teachers proving that they have undergone, they have endured 100 hours of being talked at by experts every 4 or 5 years. It doesn't make teachers better. Bigger improvements are possible if we focus rigorously on the things that matter, even when they're hard to do. I liken most policies that education departments have pursued all over the world, like the story of the drunk man who is looking for his keys underneath the streetlight. And somebody says to him, "Is this where you drop the keys?" He says, "No, but this is where the light is." We've been doing the stuff that's been easy to do, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't made our teachers better. It's now time to start trying to do the things that we know will work, even though they're hard. And we know they're hard. You know the old jokes about how many psychoanalysts does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the bulb has got to want to change. Have you heard the one about teachers? How many teachers does it take to change a light bulb? Change? So we need to think carefully about what kinds of things we ask our teachers to do, because actually time is precious. Now, one of the big ideas, that people love this, is neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience is like this army racing into the last minute to save us and help us improve. People love cognitive neuroscience. And there are lots of teachers being seduced by people who show them pictures of brains with particular regions lighting up in particular colours. It's very dangerous because it's a complete distraction. There is nothing in what we currently know about cognitive neuroscience that helps teachers teach better. It's far too primitive. Cognitive neuroscientists try to work out what's happening in one brain when you put a letter in the left visual field and a number in the right visual field. As for managing the learning in 25 different brains in the same classroom, they say forget it. Too complicated for them. Now, we know that people are seduced by neuroscience because people have done studies on it. This was quite an interesting experiment. Descriptions of 18 psychological phenomena. They produced 4 descriptions for each phenomenon. One was a good explanation without neuroscience. One was a bad explanation without neuroscience. And then they also produced what they called enhanced explanations. They just throw a bit of neuroscience in. So the good explanation was good with neuroscience, but there was also bad explanations with some bogus neuroscience. They just threw in the neuroscience just to make it look as if it was properly scientific. Everybody was asked to rate the explanations they were given on a scale of -3 to +3. So, for example, a bad explanation of a particular thing, the researchers claim that this happens because subjects make more mistakes when they have to judge the knowledge of others. People are much better at judging what they themselves know. That's a bad explanation of this thing about theory of mind. And the bad explanation with neuroscience just threw in some stuff about frontal lobe and brain circuitry and so make it sound as if it was really scientific. What was the impact of just adding in that bogus neuroscience? Well, for novices in this study, they rated the bad explanation as below average in quality, -0.7, but just adding in the bogus neuroscience, they actually improved. They said it was a good explanation. And the same for students. So just adding in a bit of bogus neuroscience made people believe stuff that was actually a bad explanation. Now, the other kinds of things you see are pictures like this. You see pictures like this, and what parts of the brain are involved in this particular task? And this is a group level activations for the recognition of words versus a baseline condition from Miller's work. And these are the kinds of things that teachers get shown. What they don't show you is where these data come from. This is what was published because it's the average across 9 different participants in the study. This is the average. Here's where the activities were in each of the individual brains. But what gets published is the average. So people's brains do things in different ways. It's all over the place. Different people's brains work in different ways. Different people's brains are conditioned by their cultural upbringing. So another study here shows Chinese and English speakers from Hong Kong reacting to different kinds of stimulus. So symbol tasks versus number tasks. And for the Chinese native speakers, the symbol task activates these pieces of brain these pieces of the brain activated. And for the English speakers, it's a completely different part of the brain. So currently, neuroscience is very interesting, but is a complete distraction. And we keep on being seduced by these sexy new ideas. It's about helping every single teacher do a better job day in, day out in terms of the craft of the classroom. What we know is that class reduction by 30%, and this is probably even a smaller effect in Norway because you've already got pretty small classes. It would cost you about £30,000 per classroom per year, and you might get an extra 4 months learning per year. If we could increase teacher content knowledge from weak to strong, we might get an extra 2 months learning per year, but nobody's figured out a way to do this yet, so we don't know how much that would cost. What we do know from work that we've done in both the US and in the UK is that when teachers do this formative assessment or assessment for learning in their classrooms, minute by minute and day by day, we get an extra 8 months learning per year, and the total cost is around about $3,000 per classroom per year. So the reason I advocate assessment for learning or formative assessment as the policy priority is because I don't see anything else that's as cost effective. It's 20 times as cost effective as class size reduction in terms of the impact that it has on the system. So even though it's hard to do, I think that's what we should be focusing on. Now the problem is that as soon as people heard that formative assessment had these big impacts, everybody jumped on the bandwagon. So when I was working in the United States, a lot of people published these things called formative tests. And what schools used to do was they would test their students every 8 to 10 weeks. And they would use the results of these tests to predict which students were going to pass the end of year examination. Doesn't tell you what to do about it, but at least your impending failure comes with plenty of advance warning, and you can begin to polish up your resume and get it ready for the next job. In England, people are focused on children knowing what levels they're working at, and it's been completely counterproductive. What we're finding is that the assessment that makes the biggest difference is the stuff that happens minute by minute and day by day in every single classroom. So, for example, a teacher was teaching 11-year-olds about probability, and at the end of the lesson, she just asked every single student on a 3x5 index card to write down, why can't you have a probability greater than 1? And the students wrote their answers on this piece of paper, and then the teacher stands at the doorway of the classroom at the end of the lesson and collects these in. She calls them her exit tickets. You can't get out of the classroom without handing one of these in. She reads the students' explanations, and then when she's done that, she puts the cards in the trash because she knows where to start tomorrow's lesson. That's an assessment. That teacher has used information about her students' current level of achievement to adjust her teaching to better meet her students' learning needs. And that's the essence of formative assessment. The trouble is that when people hear that word assessment, they think about record keeping, reporting, exams, testing. If you ask teachers, how do you assess your students, they all talk about tests and exams. If you ask them, how do you find out whether your children have learned what you just taught them, they give you a much richer range of responses. And that's the important kind of assessment. It's that assessment that happens in the lesson. The thing I just modelled with you at the beginning of today's talk, I asked you all to vote, and that did two things. First of all, there was no place for you to hide. I wanted an answer from every single one of you, and I got one. And I could have said, excuse me, you haven't voted yet. So it increased the level of engagement in this room. But the second thing it did was give me information about your current thinking so that I could use that to plan the next bit of the talk. And that's the essence of formative assessment. It is high quality information collected by teachers in the middle of teaching to adjust their teaching to better meet their students' learning needs. Now most teachers do this already, but they do it with very poor quality information. So many teachers rely on how bored the children look. They rely on the students' expressions on their faces. Some teachers even ask students to do what they call the thinking thumbs. Everybody okay with that? Yes? No? And of course what happens is the children just say yes, because you don't want to look like you didn't understand it. You don't want the teacher to pick on you. So teachers do this, but they do it on the basis of very poor quality information. So a better example for upper secondary school, for example, a teacher's teaching chemistry. She's been balancing an equation. She's doubled the amount of sulfur. Another student has suggested doubling the amount of hydrogen. So you've got this equation now, and then she asks the students, is that now correct? And every student has to vote, yes or no. And that creates no place to hide. Because if you vote yes and there's still a mistake, you've shown you didn't understand. And even worse, if you say no, there's a mistake in there, the teacher's going to ask you to come to the front and correct the mistake. So it's actually moving towards this kind of idea where the teacher is getting high quality information about the student's learning needs to adapt the teaching to better meet, to plan the instruction better. What do you need to do this? Well, we think there are three key processes: where the learners are in their learning, where they're going, how to get there. And we need to think about the role of the teacher, of the peers in the classroom, and of the learners themselves. Crossing those two axes together gives us 9 cells, which we think can be usefully broken down into 5 key strategies, as we call them. First of all, clarifying and sharing learning intentions, helping the students understand where we're going. Because learning is easier when you have some idea of where you're going. Engineering effective discussions, tasks and activities that elicit evidence of learning. It's not just questioning. If you're teaching physical education, you might get the students to do a forward roll. It's everything that you do to find out where learners are in their learning. Providing feedback that moves learners forward. Back in 1998, Paul Black and I showed that giving grades is much more harmful than giving comments. Giving comments improves learning, giving grades tends to lower achievement. So many teachers started giving students comments, but they weren't very good comments. In fact, they were generally comments about what was wrong with the last piece of work, rather than what you should do to make the next piece of work better. And there's no point in telling students what was wrong with the last piece of work if they're never going to do that again. It's like the difference between having a medical and a post-mortem. And the trouble is, most of our students get post-mortems, not medicals. But the 2 most important strategies are these last 2. Activating students as learning resources for one another, activating students as owners of their own learning. So it's actually getting students to help each other as learners, but also to own their own learning. And these 5 strategies aren't the only important things. We think they're a useful kind of umbrella to encompass other things. So, for example, activating students as owners of their own learning includes metacognition, motivation, interest, how they attribute successes and failures, and, of course, self-assessment. But we think, and our work with teachers suggests, that this is a useful way of beginning the conversation with teachers about how to improve. The big idea is to use evidence about learning to adapt instruction to meet student needs. It's a very simple idea. I'm very glad that the pilot who flew with me from Heathrow to Oslo this morning did not navigate the way that most teachers assess. Because if he had, he'd have set out from Heathrow on a bearing of roughly 060 degrees with a planned flying time of 1 hour and 50 minutes, and then after the time had come to an end, he would just sit down at the nearest airport and say, "Is this Oslo?" And the ground crew say, "No, it's Copenhagen. There was a wind from the north." And the pilot says, "Everybody off, because I've got to go and do something else now." That's what we do, isn't it? We teach the students, and at the end of the learning, we give them a test. And if they've learned it, we say, "Great." And if they haven't learned it, we say, "Too bad, because we're on to chapter 7 tomorrow." So what our pilot did, I can just get rid of this little... What our pilot did was to be clear about where he was starting from, be clear about where he was going to, planning a route, begin the journey, but then he made regular checks on progress along the way, and he made adjustments to the course as conditions dictate. So it's an incredibly simple idea, the idea that we should actually do all this as teachers. To start, be clear where we're starting from, clear about where we're going, planning the learning journey, but then making adjustments as we go. Very easy to say, very hard to do. One of the things that we've tried to do to help teachers get started on this is to give them examples. So, for example, sharing exemplars. How do students know what a good lab report looks like in science? Well, you can actually give them rules, or, more powerfully, you can give them some lab reports from last year's class, with the names removed, and ask them to talk about which one's the best, and why are they good. And what we find is that children are much better at finding mistakes in other people's work than they are in their own. And when they critique other people's work, they're able then to avoid making those same kinds of mistakes in their own work. Mini whiteboards. I don't know if you've seen this kind of thing, but again, lots of elementary schools use them, but I think they work well in upper secondary school as well. So, for example, if you're teaching advanced level mathematics in upper secondary school, you could say to the whole class, right, sketch me a graph of y equals 1 over 1 plus x squared. And then each student holds up their mini whiteboard. And you look at the whole class. And if they all got it right, you move on. And if nobody gets it right, you teach it again, but slower and louder. But the most likely outcome is there are differences of opinion, which creates a teachable moment. Because then you can say, you thought it has an asymptote along the x-axis. Why is that? You thought it has an asymptote along the y-axis. Why is that? You think it's got a line of symmetry around y equals x. Why is that? So you could bring in different students into the conversation. And what's interesting is it makes the teacher into a more skilled conductor of classroom questioning because the teacher is able to bring in different students at the right time. I sometimes joke that mini whiteboards are the most important development in educational technology since the slate. Good teachers were doing this 200 years ago. Feedback. As I said earlier, giving comments is better than giving scores or grades, but one teacher that I've been working with was still unhappy that the children weren't spending enough time reading her comments. So she was teaching 14-year-old students, and they were doing an essay on Shakespeare. So instead of writing the comments on the essay, she wrote the comments on strips of paper. And each group of 4 students gets back their 4 essays and the 4 comments on 4 different strips of paper, and they have to work out which comment goes with which essay. So they have to read all the comments and think hard about that. And it's wonderful. Okay. Coloured cups. Sorry. This is upper secondary mathematics. Lesson begins. Every student has a green cup showing on their desk. As the teacher goes through the topic, if you think the teacher's going a bit fast, you signal yellow. And if you want to stop and ask a question, you show red. Why would anyone show red? Because in this classroom, as soon as one student shows red, the teacher picks at random from all the other students, whether they're showing green or yellow, and the student who's chosen has to come to the front of the class to answer the question being asked by the student who showed red. This teacher has converted her classroom into one gigantic game of chicken. And her problem now is that the students are stopping the lesson all the time. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful that the students would say, I don't understand, stop. So these techniques are ways of getting started. We have 100 of these techniques. And teachers say, when teachers hear we have 100 of these techniques, they say, ooh, can we have the list? And we say no. Because teachers don't need lots of ideas. Teachers need to take the ideas they've already got and make them work. The most powerful teacher knowledge is not explicit, it's implicit. And that's why telling teachers what to do doesn't work. What they know is more than they can say. And so that's why most professional development has been ineffective. We've been trying to tell teachers what to do. We've been trying to get teachers to think their way into a new way of acting. And we need to get teachers to act their way into a new way of thinking so that their changes are grounded in their practice. Improving practice involves changing habits, not adding knowledge. Losing weight. It's not hard, is it? Because everybody who wants to lose weight knows there's only 2 things you have to do. Eat less, exercise more. What's so hard about that? Yeah? That is the knowledge base for weight loss. There isn't anything else. But actually what people have realized is the hard thing is not knowing what to do, it's doing it. The hardest bit is not getting new ideas into people's heads, it's getting old ones out. And that's why it takes time, and it doesn't happen naturally. Now, we're not alone in this. From the work of Ignaz Semmelweis in the 19th century, we've known that it's important for doctors to wash their hands after contact with patients. Everybody agrees about this. Nobody agrees about what we should do in teaching. Everybody agrees about hand washing in hospitals. It's a good thing to do. Particularly, for example, in neonatal intensive care units. Do you think people agree that it's important to wash your hands when you're around newborn babies? And what was the compliance rate? 29%. Changing habits is hard. So what we're suggesting is that if we're serious about helping our teachers develop, we have to understand that it's about changing teacher habits, not about adding knowledge. We need the evidence that I've shared with you today that assessment for learning should be the priority. But you also need ideas for teachers to get started. Teachers can't work from research. Teachers need practical, grounded suggestions. Teachers need choice about how to take this forward. They need to be able to adapt it to their own classrooms. They need to be able to take small steps because they need to incorporate that. Changing the way you teach has been described as a bit like engine repair in flight. It's scary stuff. It's like trying to change the engine on a plane while you're still flying. But I think we also need to make teachers accountable. I think we should make every single teacher accountable for improving their practice and then give them support to do it. So, in the same way that every teacher learns eventually that you can't do the learning for the learner, leaders cannot do the learning for the teachers. But what you can do is create a situation in which teachers learn. So teachers, I think, every teacher working in the state system in Norway should commit to the continuous improvement of practice. I need to get better. Not because I'm not good enough, but because I can be even better. You show me a teacher who isn't failing on a daily basis, and I will show you a teacher with low expectations of her students. The great thing about teaching is you never get any good at it. It's just too hard. One lifetime is not enough to master this craft. And that's what makes it such a wonderful thing to be doing. And an agreement to focus on the things that make a difference to students, and that's where the research comes in. What's needed from leaders is a commitment to engineer these effective environments for the teachers, ways of creating teacher learning, keeping the focus on the things that make a difference to students, providing the time, space, and dispensation for teachers to actually work on improvement, and finally, to support risk-taking. And that's why I think this guy, Vilfredo Pareto, is so important. He's best known as the inventor of the 80-20 rule. That he was the first person to notice that 80% of Italy's wealth was owned by 20% of the population. But his most important work is on the design of taxation systems. And he said that a Pareto improvement is a change that can make at least one person better off without making anyone else worse off. The problem is that these kinds of changes are often very hard to make. So many leaders in schools, the ones that I talk to, see their job as stopping people from doing unproductive things. And most people have already stopped doing the unproductive things. So if you're going to make a system better than it is now, the only way to do it is to stop people doing good things, to give them time to do even better things. And that's very hard. Because if you say to people that what you're doing isn't as good as it could be, they say, are you saying what I'm doing is no good? And that's not what I'm saying. It's good, but it's not as good as some other use you could be making of the same time. So the challenge for the improvement of educational systems is to stop people doing valuable things, to give them time to do even more valuable things. So the summary is that improving the performance of an educational system is a national economic priority, and that requires improving teacher quality. Improving the quality of entrance is important, but it has a small effect and it takes a long time to work through. So if you're serious about securing the economic prosperity of any country, you need to work on professional development with teachers. That professional development needs to focus on practice, not knowledge, because that's the thing that makes a difference to outcomes. And I think it needs formative assessment, because that's what has the biggest trade-off. But the formative assessment that has the biggest impact on student learning is the minute-by-minute and the day-by-day stuff, the stuff that involves teachers changing their habits, and that's hard to do. So we also need different models of professional development, which we call school-based teacher learning communities, which I don't have time to talk about today, but where teachers get together and hold each other accountable for making improvements in their practice. I'm actually now more optimistic than I have been at any point in my career as a professional developer about the possibilities for real transformation of systems at scale, because we're beginning to get both the process and the content of teacher professional development right. Focusing on practices in classrooms and understanding how hard it is for teachers to change practice because of the habits they've got into, and creating structures within schools to help teachers do that. If we do that, we are nowhere near maximising the capacity of our systems to improve, and I think, therefore, the outcome is fundamentally very, 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 very optimistic indeed. Thank you very much. I will now take some questions, or indeed take comments.
We pass around the microphone if anyone have some questions or comments or reflection on Professor Wilhelm's lecture.
The back there.
Right there. And please present yourself.
My name is Stephen Dobson. I'm a professor in education from Lillehammer and Hedmark. Very interesting presentation. I had a question. There's an English kind of saying. It says, "I don't know how to define quality, but I know it when I see it." And my experience of a lot of Norwegian teachers trying to implement assessment for learning is they become very good at using criteria and developing forms and different kind of things, but they aren't very good about sharing their experience, which they have, their tacit experience. They know what quality is, but they can't speak about it. Could you share your reflections on these kind of challenges?
Well, one of the things that we've discovered in these teacher learning communities is teachers begin to develop a language of description. So when I first started having teachers in my classroom, when I was a teacher in London in the 1970s and 80s, I was very, very little help, because I used to say to these poor student teachers, just do what I do. And I had no idea what I was doing. And having a student in my classroom and being required to talk about what I was doing actually helped me get better. I don't know if it helped them, but it certainly helped me become more reflective about what I was doing. So this idea of developing a language of description, I think, is very important. But I'd also say that what's really much more important is the improvement of practice. So when teachers often like going to other people's classrooms to observe, and they talk about sharing good practice. I actually think that's a huge distraction. I think we should be less worried about sharing good practice and more focused on helping teachers improve their current practice. I was working with teachers in Canada before Christmas, and I talked about a technique or an idea, and one teacher said, "Oh yeah, I used to do that, it was good. I used to do that, it was good." And then something else came along, and he stopped doing that good thing and did something else. So what we see is teachers don't get to a point where these things become consolidated into their practice, so then when something new comes along, the old things go out. And what we need to do is to help teachers get to a point where their practice cumulates, so they get better and better and better, rather than just displacing each new idea with a new idea. So for me, it's about how do you help teachers change their habits so that, for example, they no longer need to think about wait time. When a student gives an answer, they don't jump in. They wait 3 seconds, not because they're remembering to, but because that's now the way that they teach. That's the change we need to make. The other thing I should say is that I'm looking for incredibly modest changes in practice. I just want to get each teacher used to the idea that they need to be getting a little bit better all the time. And as long as it's somewhere in the direction of formative assessment or something else that research shows makes a difference to students, I'll be happy. It's just getting the ball rolling. At the moment, we don't have that. In most developed countries, teachers think that once you've been teaching 5 or 6 years, you're good to go. That's it. I have no more to learn about this. And the consequence of that is, if I can't get any better at this job, all subsequent problems are the student's fault. What can you expect from these students? When you shift to the idea that I can be better as a teacher, then that's a fundamentally optimistic message, because it means I can achieve more tomorrow than I did today. So for me, it's about making very small changes and getting every teacher signed up to the idea of small continuous improvement. And I'm much less worried about fidelity.
Other comments, reflections? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Teresa Hoffenbeck. Hi, thank you. I'm Teresa Hoffenbeck, University in Oslo. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I have one question, because in Norway we have a lot of research who shows that actually we have more individualized teaching the last 10 years in Norway than ever. So in a way you can say what you said about neuroscience, you can see that there's all this push for individualized teaching. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit about what you see now also in your relation to your work in the 21st century skills. You said a little bit about what is important when you have this slide of what we're losing and what we need to focus upon. Because when we have so many classrooms in Norway where students are sitting alone for such a long time, and we've seen this in evaluation studies, then I'm wondering how should we be able to transform these classrooms into classrooms which are ready for 21st century skills? Okay. Thank you.
Well, I should say, first of all, that I have a problem with 21st century skills in that you can't exhibit a single 21st century skill without some 19th century skills. Because you still need to be able to read and to do mathematics. And so the interesting thing is what do we mean by 21st century skills? And I'm on the methodological issues working group of the new development with Microsoft and Cisco. And it's proving incredibly hard to define a 21st century skill. So I think what's important is the balance between 21st century and 19th century skills. There's no doubt that individualization is seen as a solution to the problem of diversity. So this is a very Scandinavian solution. In England, we don't worry about individualization. We just put students in different classrooms. So faced with the diversity of students, we say, well, these students are clever, so they can go in one classroom, and these students are not at all clever, so they go in a different classroom. So that's how we deal with diversity in England. And both individualization and what we call setting, or streaming, or grouping by ability, or they call tracking in America, are responses to diversity. They are responses to diversity as a problem. But the best teachers see diversity as an asset. How can I change my teaching so that the differences between my students becomes part of how I teach? So, for example, a classic middle school example, I'm sure that happens, I haven't been into Norwegian classrooms for 15 years, but I'm sure it hasn't changed very much. Area of a trapezium. You know, trapezoid shape? And in America, in England, I'm sure in Norway too, the teacher introduces the idea on the board and shows the rule and maybe does one worked example, and then the students do individual work and the teacher goes up and down helping individuals. In Japan, a teacher might ask the students, they show one method for finding the area of a trapezoid, and then working in teams, the students have to come up with as many conceptually distinct ways of finding the area of a trapezoid. There are 13. What's interesting is every Japanese middle school teacher knows there are exactly 13 different ways of finding the area of a trapezoid. It's part of their subject knowledge. And I bet you no Norwegian teacher knows that. So for me, just think about the cognitive level of engagement in that Japanese classroom where the students are discussing about whether these are two different methods or the same method. And it's a way of coping with diversity, but sees different points of view, even on something as straightforward as mathematics, sees that difference of opinion as an instructional asset, diversity as being a resource rather than as a problem. But as I said, you know, I see that all the time. I see that all over the world, and particularly in mathematics, it is a response to diversity, but it's an unimaginative response, and it's not particularly helpful because the students' learning roles, they're not particularly active because they're working on their own, but they're not talking. And therefore, increasing the amount of talk, increasing the amount of discussion, increasing the level of engagement in the task would all produce better learning. So it's not what should be happening in classrooms. I understand why. It's this, how you respond to diversity. And I have to confess that back in the 1970s, I made a great use of individualized learning because it was the only way at the time I could think of responding to diversity. Now I would use very little of it. I'd have much more kids talking to each other in groups and then having discussions. And a paper I wrote with Lauren Resnick, which is coming out later this year, seems to suggest that that's actually emerging as an agreement about high-quality mathematics teaching all over the world, about what a good mathematics lesson looks like. And it does have group work and whole-class discussion and very little individualized work.
Hello, my name is Halde Solst. I'm Vice President of the Norwegian Teachers Union. I thought it was extremely interesting listening to you, and a lot of what you said I could agree with as a unionist too, you know, that every teacher should commit to becoming a little bit better, because it's a lifelong learning process and you'll probably never be good enough. So I think that's very good. But you said some things in the introduction that I didn't quite see connected to the formative assessment. Because I believe you said something about that the demand in labor markets now and in the future, well, that's how I interpret you anyway, wasn't necessarily connected to what we test as our standardized testing, which is the measure of quality for politicians and those who actually give teachers the terms under which they work and the students under which they learn. What would your thoughts be about how we should assess quality in addition to formative assessment? Because that's what we're supposed to do every day in the classroom. Right. But in addition, we also have to sort of prove our quality of our students' learning for other people, outside world.
I would have a problem answering your question if we had to choose between the two. But what the work that we've done in England shows is that if teachers teach well using these methods, then children's scores on standardized tests also go up. So the study we did in 2 counties in England called Oxfordshire and in Kent, we worked with 24 teachers. And the outcome measure that we used was the national examination, set and scored by external raters. And compared to other teachers in the same school, controlling for prior achievement of students, the teachers who were working in this way got higher grades, even though they went slower than their colleagues. So they covered less of the curriculum, but they took more of the students with them. And I think, I can't prove this, but I think what happened was that in that examination, the students who were used to working in this way actually chose to think when they were stuck rather than remember. So teachers always say to me, I'd love to teach in this way, but I still have to raise my test scores. What we've shown is you don't have to choose. Teaching in this way is, quite simply, the best way there is to raise test scores. When you teach to the test, some students benefit, most don't, because they become de-skilled. Because for most students, the amount of memorization that's required is just too great, so they can't remember everything. And when they're in the exam and they are stuck, they panic and try to remember rather than try to think. So they become less intelligent in the exam room because of what the teacher has done to them. So, as I said, we have pretty robust evidence on externally set standardized tests that when teachers teach in this way, scores go up. So, you don't have to choose.
On behalf of the Directorate for Education and Training, I would like to thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I think it was very timely for us in Norway. As you said, it's very easy to say, but it's very hard to do.
Absolutely.
And because we know that, we have established a partnership between all the major stakeholders in Norway with one focus, raising the quality of teachers. Right. And it's have a long horizon and a lot of activities within that partnership. It's called GNIST, which translated to English is spark.
That's right. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think it's. I would like to end this professional part of the reception with a 100-year-old poem from Kipling. The starting lines. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. The names are what and why and when and how and where and who. I think that was good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.